Hello, welcome to Conversations in Calvinism, as well as welcome to the Society for Evangelical Arminians YouTube channel. And we are doing a joint episode because it's a topic that's of interest to both audiences, hopefully. So the topic for today is that the governmental theory of the atonement, especially in preparation for the debate TurretinFan that you have coming up with Lucas Curcio, my brother Lucas. So I'm sure that's going to be a good debate. For starters, tell us a little bit about the debate, when it'll happen, where it'll happen, all that good stuff.
Well, it's much on my mind as one of my next debates. But in fact, although it is one of my next debates, this is a really debate-heavy month. We had your and my debate with David and William not long ago, and then we're looking forward to another team debate coming up in just a couple of days. I think on Saturday, is that right?
Yeah, the 12th. Yep, that's right. Yeah.
So that will be another epic 2 versus 2 debate. It will be you and me versus Chris Morrison and Charles Jennings, if I remember correctly, from the Free Grace position, which we've battled them before. So there shouldn't be a lot of surprises. And part of me was, when you reminded me of this, as we've been so focused on the canon debate that I really hadn't been giving all my other debates proper treatment. When you reminded me of that, I thought maybe we should switch this discussion to that. But we have discussed that topic quite a lot. And then I have another debate after that, on the 16th, I have a debate on Standing for Truth. Okay, these are all three of these upcoming debates are on Standing for Truth. So there's a debate on Saturday on Standing for Truth, then on the following Wednesday on Standing for Truth. That one's with Praise. Sometimes he goes by Praise I Am or Praise the I Am. And we're going to be discussing a free grace topic again, this time talking about sanctification specifically and its relationship to salvation. And then I think it's the 27th, if I'm not mistaken, we have a debate with Lucas Curcio. So as one logically would, that's the one we're going to be preparing for, not the two others that we won't have additional prepisodes together before. So this one we could have postponed, we're not going to postpone, and then the other ones which we can't postpone, we're just not going to be doing a joint episode on those other two. But unless we just spontaneously do it, it's not on the schedule. Let's put it like that. So all that to say, Algo says he wishes I was debating Dr. Allen, which would be unique. I don't think Dr. Allen has done a ton of online debates. So the topic, though, Lucas doesn't have the same position as David Allen, as far as I know, but he maybe has somehow similar, at least in some respects, in the sense that he doesn't agree with my view on the atonement. But we've talked about my view on the atonement quite a lot, and I thought it would be interesting to try to talk a little bit about Lucas's view. Although the topic of the debate is Lucas right or wrong? The question is, he's posted this video, and my impression is he's saying that he does agree with this. That's how I took it, not just for your information. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the governmental theory of the atonement is pretty prevalent in Methodist circle. So my church background is mostly Baptist, and it's pretty rare there. But in Methodist circles, it's not so rare. You'll see several systematic theologies that go that direction for sure. And so hopefully I can add some color commentary on that. Obviously, the Remonstrant Hugo Grotius is one of the first to articulate the position. But I think the version of it is that we'll see from Lucas is probably more so the version you see in Methodist circles, especially as modified and expressed by John Miley. Hopefully I'll get a chance to expound on those differences, but I'm a big Hugo Grotius fan, just so you know. So he's the so what was it? So he's the real deal. So he was the one that got locked up after the Council of Dort. and the Calvinists captured him and threw him in the tower, and he had to escape in a trunk. But that was their big mistake, is locking him in the tower for 3 years, because he got like a double PhD. He already had like a PhD in theology, then he got another one in law while he was locked up by Calvinists. So he ended up writing the Freedom of the Seas, which now is the basis of international law or something like that. Like basically, it's the foundation for legal principles on treaties and stuff like that. But on the other hand, he wrote several theological treatises, and including this one on the governmental theory of the atonement. So looking forward to getting into this. This will be a good one.
He is definitely, Grotius is definitely an interesting character and a noted jurist, as you said. I don't know the extent to which his legal theories are still, embodied in any particular sets of laws, but certainly that's not the point of this episode. And in fact, interestingly enough, I'm not sure to what extent some aspects of his position are carried over into what we're about to hear, but it's certainly not like a carbon copy, or it's certainly not just a wholesale adoption of Grotius's views on the atonement. It's sort of, the way I see it, it's somewhat sort of inspired by those ideas, is what we're going to hear. But maybe you and I won't agree on that point. I'm not sure. This is one of the challenges, and we don't always agree on everything, but it's okay. And also, we don't always hash out our differences before we record. So I don't know how exactly we'll land on that particular point. Alco has a different take on this. He's like, you lock him up in a Calvinist library. All right. So I'm not suggesting we should start locking up theological opponents, but I would not so much like to lock up Lucas here as lock down for ourselves the ideas he's presenting and make sure I understand them. Mostly, my main goal in this presentation is not to necessarily provide a rebuttal or an expose or anything like that, as to make sure that I understand what he's saying, and to try, to the extent I can, to provide a little bit of commentary from my own standpoint of places where it seems like I agree or disagree with what he's saying. Because on my initial listen through, and I have listened to it before going live, my initial listen through was that there's a lot of agreement I have with what he said, and some points clearly I disagree with what he's saying, but I'm not sure if those disagreements are necessarily central to his positive presentation as much as they are about his I'm definitely not a Calvinist part of the presentation. So
yeah, sure. And so just to clarify, and thank you for the comments, Discerner. So my understanding is, yes, the topic is limited atonement, but this will be focused on the atonement theory undergirding Lucas's position. So on the issue of the extent of the atonement, obviously I'm on Lucas's side and very much so opposed to TurretinFan's position. On the other hand, as to the nature of the atonement, I'm much more penal substitution. In fact, I have a debate in the works coming up on that topic on PSA, on penal substitution. Hopefully it'll happen. We'll see if it materializes. It's too soon to announce anything, but hopefully it'll come about. But so in this episode, it's tricky because on the actual debate question, I'm far more in Lucas's corner. But since TurretinFan would absolutely lose that debate, he wants to change the subject to the nature of the atonement. But from my standpoint, the extent of the atonement can be defended from either a governmental theory of the atonement standpoint or from a PSA standpoint. It's that issue is it's a separate, it's a separate question. But it's all Calvinists have, so we have to bear with them.
All we have. That is correct. Sola Scriptura, all the way. All right. So, all lighthearted jabs aside, I had forgotten it's funny because I knew in the back of my head, but I had forgotten that the that Methodists are Paedo-Baptists, and I saw when I was looking through his debates, I saw he had debated Jeremiah Nordier on baptism, and I was like, first I was thinking, because I always think of Nordier as Reformed, but he's Reformed Baptist, so it was actually one of these weird things where I'd probably be on the opposite side. I didn't listen to the debate yet, but I'd probably be on the opposite side from my usual theological ally in that particular debate. But I have never debated baptism as far as I can remember. So let's see. I mean, in a formal debate, just chit-chatting, of course. All right, so here we go. And you'll see in the background of his image, he has support for a particular political candidate. And
fight.
Or, I mean, I assume that that's all about support. So anyway, it's a great background. Happy about that. Nice presentation. I like the fact that he has a bookshelf in his video. All great elements. But this is not. Go ahead.
I would never give away my position like that.
Your position on the president?
Any political issue that I didn't have to, so as to not create unnecessary events.
I see. All right. I'm not sure. Let's just transition into discussing this governmental theory, and I'll try to hit this pause as often as I feel the need to do so. I assume that Lucas has no problem with us using this in a sort of fair use approach. Of course, if he jumps in and says, "Please stop playing my video," then I'll definitely stop playing his video. But I'm assuming he won't. And if you want to see the whole thing, the link is in the description, so you can find it there. And anyway, off we go. I've skipped over his intro music, I think.
Host Lucas Curcio, and today I'm going to be talking about the governmental theory.
Do I have it at 1x, or let me make sure? Okay, the pendulum just seemed a little bit fast in the background, but I guess it's normal.
Theory of the atonement. This is properly could be termed. There's an argument to be made that this could be the Wesleyan view of the atonement. Now, I say there's an argument to be made because Hugo Grotius is also another key developer of this view. Some might even call him the father of this view, but it could be called the Wesleyan view because these men, these scholars, are the one that really formulated this understanding of what is the atonement and why we need the atonement and what it accomplished. This is what we're talking about when we talk about theories of atonement. We're asking, what is the atonement and why do we need it, and what happened to it? There are other questions involved in this, but those are usually the ones that it centers around.
So, I mean, I think we've kind of already covered this part in terms of saying that he is taking a Wesleyan specific approach from which is sort of branched off from the original formulation. And I don't want to belabor that point. I'm just more interested in what Lucas has to say. But you're welcome to jump in if you want.
Sure. So Arminius and Grotius, of course, were friends, and they were Arminius passed away in 1609, and Grotius went on and published this work in 1617 for the first time. But this was before the Council of Dort, so they were friends, they knew each other, they worked well together. But Arminius was penal substitution, and then Wesley was too. But just because we say Arminius was penal substitution, there might have been some nuance in the way he understood the imputation of sin, or the imputation of Christ's righteousness. He certainly had questions about it. Not in the sense of Christ, the imputation of Christ's penalty in terms of the death he died, but rather his act of righteousness and obedience. Arminius had questions on that, whether that was, it's biblical to say that is imputed to us in our stead. And that's usually where people, start questioning his doctrine of justification. Wesley actually had the same thing, but took it a little bit further. So although, again, Wesley was PSA, penal substitution, not governmental theory of atonement, what his view is that justification, essentially he did away with the imputation of Christ's righteousness, but maybe even in both senses, and just kind of took justification as a synonym for forgiveness. So I think you'll see that throughout. I suspect that is the angle from which Lucas is coming from. So he's going to be looking at the governmental theory of atonement. But in addition to that, those doctrines definitely overlap with justification. And I think what he's going to be saying is that justification is essentially forgiveness of sins.
I want to talk about the governmental theory because I believe that this is a really good way to understand.
So Becky, I see.
Oh, sorry about this. That's I don't begrudge them their advertisements, but I don't necessarily want to share the audio from the advertisement. So just give me a second to come back from that.
Yeah. So while you do, just wanted to say hi to folks. Okay, so hi, Algo OPC, good to see you. Hey, Designer. So right, and then ADR, good to see you. Hey, Freddy Cosmic, evening. All right, carry on.
And also, it's a good way to understand Wesleyan theology because it is, I believe, consistent with it. Now, I will say this. John Wesley himself, he didn't hold to this view as it's understood later or as it's developed later. And really, this is, just probably a good point and time for me to say is that when we talk about theories of the atonement, you don't really have to get lost in single motifs. You can't.
This was the part where I started to think, this might be a sort of a lost, or in a sense, a rabbit trail that we're heading down. In other words, if you say that you don't want to get lost in a single motif, and then here's one of the motifs, but as long as this is not a competitive motif with other motifs, then it's fine to have multiple non-competitive. There's in other words, you can look at the atonement from many different angles. And as long as those angles aren't in competition with each other, it just means that we're seeing some new facet or some new angle or some new element of the atonement. That let me give you a more specific example. So what Socinius did, and the way I read Grotius is that he's kind of trying to respond to Socinius as his primary target. So Socinius says something like, and I'm probably oversimplifying his work here, but one of his ideas was that Jesus' life and death was as a moral example to us. Like we should live like Christ lived and be willing to die like Christ died. So he set his life and death provide a moral example to us. And it's not what he's saying there in this, as far as it goes, as far as saying that he did live a righteous life that we should take as an example for ourselves. Absolutely, that's true. And also that we should be willing to lay down our lives to the brethren. That's also true. But that's not the entirety of the atonement. If that's all you affirm about the atonement, you're not affirming enough. But it's not in itself. It's not a problem. Now, and so if someone's just saying this governmental theory is just like an additional facet that we need to understand, and it's not held in competition with other things, then we'll see. But I think the way he's presenting it, it is a little bit, at least, the way he presents it in competition with some other views. Or maybe not, but we'll see, I guess. Or you have your own idea?
Well, so no, I agree with you. So, okay, let me give you an example. So, some of these early theories, especially like Christus Victor, basically that Christ won the victory over sin and the devil. It's just at a higher level of abstraction from the governmental theory and PSA. So if I came out and just said, hey, the atonement is good, right? Every atonement theory falls under the broad category that the atonement is good. So, but I could call it the atonement is good theory of the atonement, and there you go. So what you're saying, I think, TurretinFan, is like once you get into some conflicting ideology, that's when the theories become mutually exclusive. But Christus Victor and penal substitution are not in competition. It's just penal substitution explains how Christ won the victory. The governmental theory is another explanation of how Christ won the victory. But you're right. The governmental theory, in principle, and I think in Grotius' specific case, is not opposed to penal substitution. In fact, for Grotius, it was probably an important part of Grotius's theory is a type of the governmental theory of atonement. So we haven't heard Lucas explain the governmental theory, but I mean, I can give a general, a rough sketch. But so the idea is basically, whereas penal substitution is focused on retributive justice, basically vengeance, in that aspect of Christ paying the penalty, the governmental theory is looking at public justice and the dispensation of a ruler and how their moral government and stuff like that. So it's showing that that government takes sin very seriously and is not going to just forgive it lightly or that sort of thing. So it restores justice. So both of them are a type of satisfaction of justice, but one is that focused on retributive justice, where the other is focused on, I think it's, well, whatever it's called, but it's like, but basically public justice. But so both of them are a satisfaction of justice. However, how is public justice satisfied? For Grotius, it seems very clear that his answer was through a penalty. And so that's how he integrated penal substitution with his governmental theory. But he's not the last person to say anything about governmental theory. And John Miley came along and took out the penal substitution aspect and just said, well, there's just a satisfaction of public justice in the atonement without a penal substitution. And for Miley, to your point, TurretinFan, it's like, well, you have to get down to a principle that's alternative and mutually exclusive. For Miley, he would rule out penal substitution, basically saying you can't punish an innocent person for somebody else's crimes. That's illogical and absurd and that sort of thing. So that theory aligned with his version of the governmental theory of atonement. So his version of the governmental theory of atonement was mutually exclusive with PSA, whereas Grotius's was not. So it's a little bit complicated. Arminius and Wesley wouldn't agree with John Miley on this point. In fact, they didn't. But John Miley did, and so you might have to suss that out in the debate. Where is Lucas coming from? Usually the way to get at it is like the Romans 5 and the imputation of original sin versus the imputation of Christ's righteousness and that sort of thing. But you might be able to quickly get to an answer in it. I don't think he's going to answer it here in this video as to where exactly he stands on that specific point. But if you're wondering whether his governmental theory is mutually exclusive with PSA, I think you need to know that, because it's, at least for Grotius, his view was not mutually exclusive with PSA. In fact, it just seems like a different version of it.
Yeah. And there's I don't want to get into too much of, I'm not trying to be critical of Lucas's view from the standpoint of, does it line up with Grotius's view or not? There is a video also in the description on the YouTube that has a link to William Lane Craig's short summary of this same view, and he makes a big deal about it not being against penal substitution. The point isn't like, well, so Lucas, and now you have to take penal substitution if you're taking the governmental theory, but just to say that just to kind of, I guess, underscores the point you're making, Dan, which is that there's an evolution to this thought, and that there's not just one, the governmental theory. There's different flavors of it, and there's certain flavors that include penal substitution of some kind as part of that view, at which point maybe it's totally acceptable from my standpoint. Maybe, I don't know. We'll kind of come to that, I guess, as we come to it. Okay, to continue?
Please.
And acknowledge there are other motifs. That is, usually what happens is when I discover this view of the atonement or that view of the atonement, it's not that the theory in and of itself as one part and piece is wrong, but it's wrong in that it excludes all others. And so, for example, if you want to hold to a view where Christ is the victor of the atonement, it is the Christus Victor view of the atonement, where Christ defeated Satan, defeated death, he was victorious, and that is what the atonement accomplished. Well, that's true. Christ did triumph over Satan and hell. That's true. That's not all he did. There were other things that he did. And so you can acknowledge there is this motif in the atonement, but that's not the only motif in the atonement. And so when I look at John Wesley, I can see that he didn't just hold to the penal substitutionary view of the atonement. And that is probably the one that's most popular today, where Christ suffered. I'm not going to use the term exact equivalent, but it was pretty much close to it, where our debt was paid in a monetarily narrate or value, where the example would be is, say, like, I owe $1 billion, where Christ, the penal substitutionary model would say Christ then therefore paid by my $1 billion. So it's understood through terms of commerce, where again Christ paid my debt in this way, in that way. And so John Wesley did believe that Christ did pay for our penal sufferings. So there's a penal motif in John Wesley's theology, but there's also a governmental view. Even if he didn't formulate that or say that, I believe that the Wesleyan scholars properly did build on this understanding. And you can see this when it comes to how we understand justification. Because when we talk about justification.
So before we get too much into justification, I mean, obviously you heard a lot of agreement to what we had just said, that you could put other things like Christ as victor over death as an aspect of the atonement. And it's not competitive with penal substitution. It's not competitive with governmental view, which we haven't really heard the full discussion of it yet from Lucas's standpoint. And there's also this kind of this question of, he started to introduce what he doesn't like about penal substitution, which is that I guess he views it as kind of commercial and a payment of an equivalent of the same or equivalent value or something like that. And he seems to not care for that, but not caring for that doesn't really directly have anything to do that I can see with governmental theory as such. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just not. I think maybe what he's saying is he doesn't feel like he needs that because he has this other thing.
No, Lucas is right. Certainly, that's a concern that's expressed by almost everyone that it discusses governmental theory, including Grotius. The problem is that I don't think that penal substitution works that way, because it's a crime. It's not a commercial transaction. If it was like $1 billion debt versus $1 billion payment, I think there would be significant problems. But I just don't think PSA is that way.
Or at least it doesn't have to be that way, but maybe.
So if you want to say, you can use a commercial transaction as an analogy, and it does have some points of analogy, but the exact equivalence is not the point of analogy. It's more like, we can Venmo each other money, but we can't Venmo each other guilt. There's no such thing. So you can't transfer guilt like that commercially, one person to another.
Well, I'm trying to avoid too many rabbit trail or sidetrack debates on the details. But I think the point we could probably agree on is at a minimum that one can hold to a version of penal substitution without without having a very heavy emphasis, or essentially just downplaying the commercial aspects altogether.
Yeah. So, okay, let's set aside the commercial aspect. I think here within PSA, there are advocates that do say Christ paid the identical penalty, but there are other PSA advocates that say he paid an equivalent penalty or a substitute for a penalty. Now, let me see if I can explain it. So, I don't know. Okay, so if I were to, this is my earbuds case, but if I substitute my coffee mug, for the earbuds case, they're maybe equivalent in weight or something like that, but they're not the same. And even if I had another earbud case, it still wouldn't be the identical earbuds case. So once you introduce the idea of substitution, it doesn't seem like it could be identical. Just the idea of substitution seems mutually exclusive with it being the identical penalty. It's a substitute. The penalty that Christ pays is a substitute for our penalty rather than the identical penalty. But there are some PSA advocates that do try to say it's an equivalent penalty. Now, in my estimation, they run into serious problems. And in fact, they run into the criticisms that Grotius leveled at it, as well as the issues that people like John Miley leveled at it, and Lucas would rightly, if that was the position you take in the debate, he would rightly level them at you, which are going to be basically, then there is no such thing as forgiveness, which is obviously unbiblical because there's 100 passages in the Bible about forgiveness. But if Christ paid the identical penalty that we deserved, then there's nothing to forgive. It's gone. It's just pure justice without any aspect of mercy. So, and that's the point that Grotius and John Miley and those guys were just hammering home, which is if it's an identical penalty, forgiveness is toast.
So, I don't want to turn it into that debate on that point. I just want to my main point was to highlight that if you think of the penal substitutionary atonement camp as a large camp, there's different elements of the camp, and not all those elements would feel like what Lucas just described matches their position. It might match some people's position, but it wouldn't necessarily match everybody in that penal substitution camp. I think that would be a reasonable assessment.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And all right.
And normally is determined by your view of the atonement and vice versa. And so
he was to remind where we are. He said justification is somehow informed by your view of the atonement and vice versa.
John Wesley believed that the justification should be understood as pardon. What is justification? It's God forgiving us and pardoning us of our sins, saying that in Christ, because of Christ, we are forgiven, and He acquits us of our past transgressions.
I notice this emphasis on past transgressions and acquits us and pardons us, without any emphasis on future guilt, and without. There's one other thing that he hasn't brought up, another aspect of justification he hasn't brought up, and that's intentional on his part because he doesn't include it as justification. As far as it goes, I do agree that that's part of justification. I just don't think that's the whole of justification. I'm not sure how it's going to feed. I'm not sure how logically you go from there to governmental view, but so far, from my standpoint, he's presented an incomplete picture of justification. I don't know if you have other comments on that, or wait till he comes.
So no. So okay. So aligning this with the view of the atonement, if Christ paid the equivalent penalty for our sins, then there would be no room for forgiveness. That's the position that he's arguing. Now, you're right in that. What about other aspects of justification? But I think it's important not to miss that first point, which is he's saying if PSA is understood in terms of an equivalent, no, an identical penalty, then there's no room for forgiveness. But justification is forgiveness. Therefore, the atonement is not the payment of an equivalent penalty. So that's a position he's taking. Now, in addition to that, there's the second question of what exactly is justification? And a very important part of it is the forgiveness of sins, or the non-imputation of sins. You see that in Romans chapter 4. But that is not the whole of it. In here, I actually would disagree with Lucas. And but I understand that he's aligned with Wesley and I am not. But I take justification to involve the non-imputation of sin, but in addition to that, it's the declaration of righteousness. And one of the exegetical reasons I would do that is because there are passages that say that God is justified, and that can't mean that God is forgiven of anything. He's perfect, so he's God. So it must mean that he's just declared righteous.
Now, you mentioned non-imputation. He does. My take on when he says forgiven past sins, I don't think he's endorsing a non-imputation view. I think he's in just a simple forgiveness of past sins view. So, like, no longer imputing those specific sins, but there's not a forward-going non-imputation.
Yeah, I'm sure he would say, right. I mean, I think in that I would probably agree with him, because as we walk in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus Christ cleanses us from all sin. So as we continue to believe, we continue to be cleansed from our sins. Yeah, so I think I would agree with him there. If that's
So do you think that we do have ongoing, like, so suppose we'll call him Trump. Trump, let's say Trump believes today and he's justified and his past sins are forgiven him. And then tomorrow he does something sinful. Are you saying that sin is imputed to him, but then subsequently, if he does the right things, if he repents or whatever else, that then it can be forgiven him?
No, it's as long as he's continuing to believe, he continues to be justified. So the justification is ongoing. But what I don't believe is that yesterday somebody like me, I won't use Trump, but let's say me, I wasn't justified yesterday of the sins that I committed today. I was justified today of the sins I committed today because I believed today.
Interesting. Well, I don't want to debate the point, but it is interesting that we have some nuanced different take on that. And I'm not sure, I'm not 100% sure where Lucas stands on I haven't read everything he said. I haven't listened to all his videos yet. He has some things that seem to suggest that he's open to the idea of Christian, like what I think of as Wesleyan perfectionism, the idea that a person can live a perfectly holy life with no need for forgiveness of sins because there's no sins being committed.
So even those that hold to entire sanctification would still say that not every Christian is perfect. So there's got to be a solution to sins when Christians commit them, and they would say that they're justified by faith.
But I don't know what he says. Like, and I haven't heard his statement about that. Whether he says like a person has to, because I could be wrong, but I thought that his position is that a person can lose their salvation. Yeah.
But okay, so the question is how, right? So I don't think Lucas, well, actually, I haven't met any Methodists that say every time you sin, you lose your salvation. That would be rare.
Well, I just don't know. I'm not trying to impute some bad theology to him. I'm just saying I haven't heard his view on that. But it makes me very uncomfortable when he puts it justification as only backwards looking.
Well, maybe I'm more comfortable because I just interact with these views a little bit more. But you know, the typical way it's explained is as you continue to believe, you continue to be justified. And I mean, I would suggest you consider that as his view, unless you hear otherwise. You can suss it out in Q&A if you want, or something like that. But if you go down the road of, well, you know, Lucas is holding this view, you have to be perfect, otherwise you go to hell. I think you'll end up in just going down the wrong road.
Oh, well, this is, I mean, for the debate, we're not even talking about Luke. I mean, if Lucas brings up his view, he brings up his view, but it's not really about his view in the debate. This is about, his debate's framed around limited atonement, which he doesn't hold to. So I'm not worried about, I mean, I would, if I feel, you know, if it comes up what his view is in the debate, I'd love to have a preparation for that. But my arguments in the debate are not going to center on his view at all, because I'm not there to, you know, defeat his view. I'm just there to proclaim the truth of Scripture, and that doesn't really depend on whether he's Wesleyan or Roman Catholic or anything else. It just doesn't. My position is going to be the same. So, yeah, but I kind of do want to know what he sees as the problems with my view, because that will help guide me as knowing, like, which things I should be prepared to answer questions about, or which points are likely to be the points of clash in the debate. So if he did hold to a view that, you know, like a Roman Catholic view, where you can commit mortal sins and that can derail you from salvation, then that would be very helpful for me to know in terms of potential arguments he might raise, but not in terms of, you know, what my own position would be. Or I'm certainly not going to bring that up. If I thought that's his position, I wouldn't bring it up anyway, unless he makes it an issue. That's just the way I do these kind of debates. So, I mean, I kind of leave that up to him, you know, raising his own points. But yeah. Let's see. And you're right. I mean, maybe that I deal mostly with Roman Catholic, much more with Roman Catholics than with Methodists. So I don't know. So I tend to hear something that departs from my view, and then I start to think of it as well, what would a Roman Catholic say in this position? And that's not the same thing as Methodist. They're not the same animal. All right. Onward, or?
Mm-hmm.
But going to the governmental theory of the atonement, I believe that this is consistent with Wesleyan theology, because it also rejects the Reformed view, where Christ, because of Christ's death, he was not only a substitute for our penal sufferings, but also our obedience, and that gets lost for many people, where they then take this and they think, oh, because Christ died for my sins, I can just live however I want and live like a heathen. It doesn't matter. Once they'd always save is true.
All right. So this tied with what he said before about justification is just about the sins that are past, and he does have an objection to the idea that Christ's righteousness is imputed to us. So the imputation of Christ's righteousness, I don't see how it's directly connected with the governmental theory, but he definitely does object to that view. And he said he seems to treat it as though what the result is, you can live however you want and you'll still be saved. Once saved, always saved. Which, yes, somewhat more a caricature if he's trying to describe the Reformed once saved, always saved view. And it certainly is a caricature if he's talking about a classical Arminian view. But that the implied negation is, so is he saying you can do some serious sins that cost you your salvation? If he's not saying that, then I'm kind of confused about why this objection. But if he's, again, as you said, it does matter. It makes a big difference what he means by rejecting once saved, always saved. There's different ways to reject it. And one way is to say, if you stop believing, you're not justified. That's one way to reject it. Another way is to say, if you sin seriously, you're not justified and without repenting or something like that. That's a different way to reject it. And from my standpoint, there's a world of difference between those two different rejections. And one is much more serious, but I'm not sure. Go ahead.
So do you think that perseverance of the saints involves a guard against kind of continual wallowing in sin, or basically ongoing lifestyle of sin?
Yeah, this is yes. Short answer, yes. This ties into my debate with Praise the I Am, or Praise I Am. I'm sorry that I don't know the right name moniker to give him. I'll just call him Praise going forward. So my debate with Praise is about sanctification and the kind of how important or how essential sanctification is in a believer's life. And it is essential, but so I do agree, to come back to your question, that part of salvation is not the believer not fully or finally departing from the faith. But go ahead.
Okay, so I think that's part of the concern. Now it almost seems like Lucas is blaming Calvinism for free grace theology or something like that. But because the people that actually hold the position that Lucas is expressing concern about, frankly, are the free grace guys. But on the other hand, I would say that does not apply to Calvinists like yourself, who say that the perseverance of the saints is necessary because we're being, we're being preserved from something, and that's total and final apostasy. But I think it's more than just that, because to me, at least the exegesis I've seen of like passages like, let's say, whoever keeps on sinning is of the devil, in 1 John, I've often seen Reformed exegetes say that God is saving us from the inside out. Now, it's not perfected in this life. It comes in fits and starts. There's progress here and there, but there's always like a pulse. When it comes to works, it's never, just living like the devil, so to speak. So I think that there's that aspect too. So I think you would have solid response. Now, he might be saying, well, what about the psychology of it, the practical aspect of it? And that's a different question. But I think the embodiment of his objection is it's the free grace position. They're the guys that are saying the things that he's concerned about right now.
So I'll just get Charles and Chris to tag in for this part of the debate if we go down that trail. Just let them know we'll debate them first, and then I'll during the while we're off camera, I'll just ask them. So please show up for that debate, and when I ask you, tag in here and deal with this particular objection, because I don't view the free grace folks as Reformed. I mean, they're part of the Protestant Reformation broadly, but I wouldn't call them Reformed. I'm sure they don't want to be called Calvinist for sure. I know that. I think Chris will be very upset if someone starts calling him a Calvinist. So yeah. All right. Onward.
Yeah, please.
So as long as I believe over here, Christ paid for my sufferings once, bam, I'm in. I can then go and abandon the faith and be an atheist and go to heaven.
So that definitely is not Reformed theology. That is free grace. It's some versions of free grace. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know if it's every single version. I think it is. I think if you don't hold that, I don't know how you're free grace. But,
that's kind of what makes them free grace. Yeah.
But yeah, that's so. But I hope that if Lucas listens to this, he'll know that that isn't the position I'll be offering in the debate. And hopefully, if he listens to my debate, your and my debate with Chris and Charles, that might be further evidence to him that that he's got the wrong side of the debate, if that's what he's objecting to. And if that was the only thing he were objecting to, then we could just wrap up the discussion here and say, hey, we're all one big happy family. But this is not necessarily conversations in unity. There's some differences of view that probably need to be sussed out. And I think there's still some legitimate differences. Onward?
Yes.
And that is entirely not true, because justification is when God says we're holy, and sanctification is when God makes us holy. And this does and is.
I appreciate Lucas saying that. But he's got to compare that with what he said previously, where justification is pardon. It is pardon, but it's also God saying that we're holy, right? God declaring us righteous. Now, once you have that, you have to ask him, okay, so what on what basis? And as long as it's Christ's righteousness, then he's got more of a, I would say, more of a Lutheran view rather than a Wesleyan view at that point, because Wesley, I don't think, would have said that. But anyways, carry on. But I'm glad to hear Lucas saying that.
Substantiated, solidified by our view of the atonement, because what did Christ accomplish on the cross? And so what Christ accomplished on the cross, I'm going to go to the scriptures to show.
ChatGPT.
So it's good that he goes to the scriptures to show it. Let me try to. Oh, that's the right way. Sorry about that. Let's dump this off the screen for a second.
So while you're doing that, just hey, Brother Martin, good to see you. It's been a while. Good to see you, bro. Okay, yeah, you're right. So right, entire sanctification isn't this idea where if you're not perfect, you're gonna go to hell. Yeah, I agree. And then, hey, Michelle, good to see you also. And okay, got
it. Sorry about these interruptions. But all right, onward.
Oh, that's what we should be doing. We should be going to the scriptures.
Oh, by the way, I do fundamentally, I know Dan does as well. We go to the scriptures. That's the methodologically correct approach.
To show what the cross accomplished, what the crucifixion of Christ accomplished, what our theory of the atonement should be. We should go to the scriptures. And so the scripture that I believe is really a key text for the governmental theory of the atonement is Romans 3:25. Now, at this point, though, let me just, before I forget, let me define what the governmental theory of the atonement is. And so the governmental theory of the atonement, in a nutshell, is that the death of Christ satisfied the public justice of God, upholding his government and the good of the government, so that God is justified to justify. And think about that phrase, God is justified to justify. And what this means is, if we are guilty sinners, which we are, how then could God, as the governor of this universe, say, Lucas, you're forgiven, without being unjust? Because if you think about it, if somebody murders, think of if you're a family who has, or if you're a husband, or if you're a wife and you have a child, if somebody murdered your child and he was to go to court, and the court declared, or the judge declared, you know what, I know you killed their child, but I'm going to let you off the hook because I'm merciful and I'm loving. How would you feel about that? Internally, you would object and say, that is unjust. He killed my child. He deserves to die. So with sinners, how then could God, as judge, governor of this universe, say, two guilty sinners, I'm going to let you off the hook, even though he doesn't use that language. I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to pardon you, even though you're guilty, because I'm loving and merciful. How can God do that without being unjust? And the answer is because Jesus died as our substitute.
I'm going to pause him there, because up to this word about as our substitute, I'm told if we set aside that he says as our substitute, then I'm kind of not seeing. I'm seeing the problem that he's raising. The problem is, if God just gratuitously forgives sin, then there's some kind of lack of public justice. Now, if Christ dies, then his view is that this satisfies public justice. But the question then is, well, how does it do it? He says it's because he does it as our substitute that it satisfies public justice. But again, I'm trying to figure out how it is that it's that he's a substitute for us and public justice is satisfied. That it's satisfied when we are forgiven. It's still public justice is still satisfied, and the reason that he gives is because Christ died as our substitute. I'm not 100% sure I see, like, if we use his analogy, like if the answer is okay, let's pick I don't remember the Godfather movie. One of the Godfather's sons gets murdered by somebody, and suppose that the judge says, okay, well, I'm going to forgive the murderer of your son, but somebody else has been killed. Like, I'm not sure how that satisfies a person's sense of the personal sense of justice for the relatives of the murdered person, that some other unrelated person has been killed as a substitute for the murderer.
Right, because you're thinking of retribution.
Well, I'm not sure. Maybe it's because I'm thinking of retribution. I don't know. I'm thinking of he's the one who presented it as, if it's one of your relatives that gets killed, you want justice, you want vengeance, I guess, and vengeance isn't satisfied when somebody else that's not the murderer is put to death. So given that that's his example, I'm not sure how he solved the problem that he's created.
So, right, the circumstances in which somebody else would die, it minimally would show that it was important to that governor, but not as a judge, but as a governor. Because if the governor said, hey, I can't just forgive you, I can't let you off the hook, and then someone volunteers to die, and then, okay, that shows that the governor takes sin seriously. I think that's the point that he's raising.
That means that sin is taken seriously. Okay, go ahead.
So Grotius distinguishes between like a personal relation and a personal crime. So we are supposed to forgive without any payment, right? So, if I do something bad to you, you do something bad to me, we're supposed to just forgive each other, right? And you don't have to pay me money. You don't have to pay the penalty or whatever the case might be. I'm supposed to just forgive you because we're private individuals. But a judge or a president would not be a very good judge or president if that's what they did, right? Like I don't want to. You can't just. I don't want to get too political, but you can't just turn the other cheek when someone is building a nuclear arsenal. Okay, so as individuals, yes, you can and should turn the other cheek, but as somebody who's in charge with the defense of a country, you can't just do that. Nor would we think any judge is a good judge if they forgave everybody 100%. They wouldn't be fulfilling their duty. And so that's the issue that the way Grotius framed it. So when it comes to God as, and again, this is what's important. Important is that Grotius looked especially at the passages in Revelation, the judgment coming from the throne, and it came down to an issue of God's sovereignty, and he said that judgment is a function of God as a king, not as a function of God as a as just a judge, but as a king. And so in that he can't and would not forgive us apart from a death shows that it's not as a private person, nor is it a light matter for the judge. But the judge the king. The king needs a public demonstration that it is very serious that sin happened and that there's a heavy penalty to pay. And that's why it fulfills that role of restoring public justice when Christ is required to die in order that we could be forgiven.
Let me set some of my objections to that scheme to the side. If I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, this is the case that if God decided not to show mercy to anyone, then this wouldn't be necessary because God could just mete out judgment on everyone who sinned if he had decided not to show mercy to anyone.
Right.
So, but as soon as he wants to show mercy to even one person, he needs to show that he takes sin seriously, and so some public demonstration of the seriousness of sin is necessary.
Right. He in a sense, he can't just forgive sin without that being undermining his sovereignty and his legislation and his law. Go ahead.
So there's other things that I can imagine, other reasons for him needing to do this, but in terms of the idea that people won't know that he's serious about punishing sin, why? I guess my question is why aren't, like, let's say that God decides to show mercy on one person and everyone else gets punished. Doesn't that still show that God takes sin very seriously and punishes it very, very heavily, even though for one person he is in fact showing mercy? Like, why does there need to be a substitution at all, as long as there's at least some people on which God's wrath is shown? Doesn't that display that God takes sin seriously? And
so, in the case of the person that he just forgives without an atonement, that seems to be undermining of his sovereignty and his law.
It's undermining his law because the law has been broken by this one person. In this one case, it's been broken, but in many other cases, it's been broken, and he punishes those people. So
hang on. Let me present my screen for a second. I'll share a verse that Grotius expounded upon, but to the scriptures is a good thing, right? So okay. So let's take Revelation 16:5. And I heard the angel in charge of the water say, "Just are you, O Holy One, who is and was, for you brought forth these judgments." Okay. God is just because he's bringing judgments. Right? So, in the example you gave, if God isn't bringing out the judgments, then is he not just?
I'm certainly not suggesting that God doesn't bring judgments. And of course, on my view, he does. So I'm not suggesting that I'm holding to sort of a photo inverse of this other view. But what I'm trying to get at is I'm trying to understand the underlying rationale for saying that there's a demonstration of public justice that's needed. Now, if the suggestion is that we need, for each specific violation that's forgiven or pardoned or whatever the other word we want to use, that there needs to be some corresponding demonstration, I certainly can appreciate if your point is that, like, even if in one case some sin goes unpunished, then there's an undercutting of this, of
God's
the
justice.
seriousness of sin or something like this.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure how that's public justice and not just simple retributive justice, like penal substitutionary atonement has always affirmed.
So it can be both. And for Gratius, it was both. But so take like a death penalty. There's two effects. One is it ends the life of the person that's killed. But that's not all the death penalty does.
It also has a deterrent effect. It also has vengeance effect and lots of things.
So the deterrent effect is another way of saying that the public knows how serious the government takes such heinous crimes.
Right. My point on this is not in terms of the retributive justice part. I understand why it's necessary for each violation to receive a severe punishment for retributive justice. But for showing how serious this sin is, it seems like just a couple of examples of the punishment of the sin being harshly punished would do the job of showing that the sin is very serious and can be punished very harshly. So I'm concerned that this, in other words, I think that the problem that there's if the only reason for Christ's atonement was just to show that God takes sin very seriously, like I kind of think hell already shows that God takes sin very seriously. I think that that's why I'm finding this now. This is not a criticism of Grotius's view, because, as you said, he also has penal substitution, but I am concerned about one where it's completely just the public justice.
So I hear you there, but let me. But I still even come back to, let's say that some people got punished, but others don't. Well, that seems inconsistent, but I guess I would just fundamentally ask you, doesn't justice demand the punishment for such crimes?
I agree.
In all cases, like in 100% cases. Yeah. Right.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So is it, so even if you have exceptions, isn't that sending the wrong message to the public that justice doesn't demand it? We just do it when we feel like it. We punish them when we feel like it, but when we don't feel like it. It's not a principled matter. Our law itself isn't that fundamental. It's just, we have laws and we uphold them when we feel like it, and we don't. That's not a great message to the public either.
It is, interestingly, the message that we actually have to the public in places like the U.S. But because there are presidential pardons that people get that completely absolve them, and there's no corresponding, there's no governmental satisfaction. So, and yet I don't hear people saying that, I don't know, whatever things that people are getting pardoned for, that those aren't serious violations. In other words, I don't think that it doesn't seem to be the case that just because the justice system doesn't punish in every case, that people have that the result is just that people are like, it's really no big deal.
I hear your point, but I mean, although I think there could be some counterexamples where there's presidential pardons and people are saying, people are getting away with stuff now. But at the same time, not the point. I think you probably get my point too. So we can probably move on, especially maybe going back to Lucas just for the sake of time. But I've registered your thoughts, and I'll chew on them some more.
I mean, the ultimate part is not that I think that God should just gratuitously forgive sin. My point is that you need penal substitutionary atonement. That's my point. But I'm not. That's my. I just want to make that clear to the listeners who might be thinking that TurretinFan's gone off that he's been taking crazy pills or something. So they already thought that, some of them, but let's get back to Lucas.
He died in our place as a substitute for our penalties.
It sounds so much, the way he's just expressed it, he died in our place for our penalties, sounds so much like penal substitutionary atonement that I'm glad he's saying it. And but it's funny that he's said that he's adamant against it, but I guess it's because he associates it with the free grace position.
No, I really, really do think that it's the question of substitution versus identical. I think it is that subtle, because if it's the identical penalty, there's going to be some problems. But anyways, carry on. But I've already said my piece on that.
Okay.
So that God his public justice was demonstrated and satisfied, so that he could be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus Christ. So God is not unjust by forgiving us, because Jesus Christ died in our place as a substitute for our sins, and therefore because of Christ and what he did on the cross for us, God can say to those who have faith in Jesus Christ, I forgive you. And so this upholds the public justice of God. And that's a key term for understanding the governmental theory of the atonement. So Jesus was and is a propitiatory sacrifice. I have a hard time.
By the way, I do agree that the fact that Christ sent his only son to die for sins shows how seriously God takes sin. And so that element of the governmental theory, I totally agree with. It's not that I disagree with it. I'm concerned about it pushing out some other, unnecessarily, in my view, pushing out some other view that doesn't have to be competitive with it. So I'm sorry. If you can continue, or if you have other rebuttals or other things you want to add, please feel free.
So, I mean, if this comes up in the debate, I think you want to get quickly to, is his baseline theory that you can't punish an innocent person for somebody else's crimes? I mean, because if that's the basis, then it is mutually exclusive. But if not, the governmental theory and the PSA theory they align very nicely. But I think that is the core, and at least for John Miley, that's what he was hammering on.
Hold on a second, though. We agree that Christ is innocent of their crimes, right? That he doesn't think that Christ is actually guilty of those.
Who?
None of these opponents of my position say that Christ is actually guilty.
So, okay, yeah. Well, I don't know. So I think where they might object to is the idea that our sins were placed onto Jesus. Not the consequence of the sins, but the guilt of the sins.
Okay.
So Miley definitely objected to that idea.
Let me rephrase my point. Do they think that an innocent man died in the crucifixion?
I'm sorry, and who is they again?
Whoever's my opponent in this debate, whether you're talking about Grotius or Miley or Lucas, are any of those saying that Jesus is not innocent, or that he didn't die? They all say he died. Surely, I mean
they all say he died.
Yeah, and they should all say that he's actually innocent, right? They don't say he sinned or he was actually guilty, right? Or am I wrong? I mean, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. As you said, you've interacted more with them than I have.
Okay, so let me be careful. Miley would say Christ was innocent. Grotius, I do not remember if but I think he does say that our sins are imputed to Christ. So
imputed
in
to him,
that,
but
yes,
he doesn't have personal guilt.
He's not personally guilty, but you could say he's the representative of the guilty in union with the guilty. Yeah, I guess you might say.
So then this objection that you mentioned, that an innocent person dies for someone else's sins, you're saying, for, if I heard you correctly, for Grotius, that's not an issue. He thinks that Jesus does die for other people's sins.
Yes.
And then I can't imagine that Lucas would say Jesus doesn't die for anyone's sins.
Right. I think, yeah. So if so it comes down to whether he believes our sins are imputed to Christ. I'm not sure if Lucas would say that or not.
Okay. Oh, so is what you mentioned to me, the question you said that you mentioned to me, is that a question that's critical of his position or a question that's representative of his position?
It's okay. What I'm saying is, okay, you might want to quickly get to a wedge question that to determine, is his governmental theory consistent with PSA or is it mutually exclusive with PSA? And one way to do that is to ask him, are our sins imputed to Christ? That would do it pretty quickly.
Because if he says that they are imputed to Christ, then he agrees with PSA?
Then at least it's not mutually exclusive with PSA. But if he says, no, because, you can't have an innocent person suffering for somebody else's crimes, then that is antithetical to PSA.
Okay. But then I'm very puzzled. Let's suppose that we say it. I'm not trying to impute this actual position to Lucas, but suppose that I do ask him the question and he says, no, our sins are not imputed to Christ. But he still says that Christ died as our substitute. In what way is he our substitute? And in what way is there's a public satisfaction of justice if there's no imputation, if there's no, what's the connection? What kind of connection that's not an imputation?
Yeah, good question. So you could maybe have a consequential, like the substitute for the penalty, but you could have a substitution for the satisfaction, but you couldn't have a substitution for the satisfaction of justice, right? Okay, so when we say Christ is our substitute, what exactly are we saying? So what I mean is at least two things. Instead of me dying, he died. But also, instead of me satisfying God's justice, he satisfied God's justice. Right. Mm-hmm. Now, that first one, instead of me dying, he died. I think even John Miley would agree with that.
Okay.
But I think John Miley would disagree with it on the satisfaction of justice. He would just say, not that, my sins were imputed to Christ and his righteousness to me, and therefore, I'm justified that way. No, he wouldn't say that. He wouldn't go that road at all. He would just say, because God because Christ upheld God's moral government, now God can freely forgive me. Okay. All right. Anyways.
Is it okay to continue a little bit?
Please.
I should point out, my original intent was to get through all approximately 12 minutes of this. We may not get through it just because of time constraints and my frequent pausing. But everyone who wants to hear the rest, if we don't get to all of it, there's a link in the description.
I'm saying that word. Propitiatory. Jesus Christ satisfied the public justice of God. He is the propitiation for our sins. There we go. I can say it now. He's the propitiation for our sins.
You can sell.
Sorry again. So many of these ads. Just 1 second. I will bring it right back momentarily. All right. Unmute. Skip.
And that means that he satisfied the justice of God. And we understand this by using the word public justice. It was a public demonstration of his righteousness, that the law, which was against us, is against us because we've broken the law. Not that the law is bad, but we broke the law, and it shows us our sin, and we're sinners, and the penalty is death. Jesus Christ died as our substitute in our place to the law's penalty, and therefore it's satisfied and demonstrated the justice of God, and therefore God can say, Lucas, because you have faith in Jesus Christ, I forgive you. And the key text for this, to showing this, is Romans 3:25, which says, whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood, Jesus' blood, through faith, and listen to this, to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance, God had passed over the sins that were previously committed. And then he says in verse 26, to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So notice we have that word demonstrate twice in verse 25 and in verse 26. And so Paul here is teaching that the death of Christ demonstrated his righteousness. And then that phrase, as I use, God is justified to justify, is found in verse 26, or I'm using that from verse 26, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. And so Paul is saying that Jesus died so that God might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So Jesus' death justified God, if I can use that language, he justified God by declaring, or so that he could declare sinners, guilty men, forgiven, because he died as a substitute in their place as a sin offering. And this was demonstrated publicly. It wasn't hidden. It was for all the world, his entire government to see. And so it upheld the common good and upheld his moral government. It wasn't, or you cannot then go to God and say, this is unjust. You're forgiving people, you're letting them off the hook. No, I gave my son, Jesus Christ, as a substitute for their sin. Therefore, I am justified and I can justify who I want. And so this is the heart of the governmental theory of the.
Now, I notice here he said for their sin as well. So, I mean, in fact, from what he's just stated, I don't remember the translation, any translational issues with the wording. It didn't sound, I don't remember the difference in wording. The King James has the wording, whom God has set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood, to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins that are passed through the forbearance of God, to declare, I say, at this time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of him which believes in Jesus. So I don't know how Algo says, look how puzzled I am. Well, I am a little bit puzzled because he presents he's very strong up front, and we heard him say how he definitely isn't holding to a different position. But then this part of his view, at least as he's just explained it, I don't have any strong objection to what he's just said. I don't know if you do, Dan. I don't, that I've heard at least.
So no, I think the governmental theory of atonement does a good job explaining what happens up until prior to the person coming to faith. So but what it doesn't handle as well, doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't explain as well, is the application of Christ's blood to the individual. I think that's where it's accurate but incomplete, and I think Grotius solved that by basically saying, well, that's the penal aspect. That's where we have justification in terms of not just forgiveness of sins, but also imputation and that sort of thing. So, long story short, I think you need PSA to explain what happens once Christ's blood is applied to an individual.
Atonement. There's a whole lot more to be said. I still want to do more readings on the atonement. It's a big topic. There are other motifs in the atonement. I think this is a prominent one, and this is a big one, and this is one I think that's in contradistinction to other views out there that would view the atonement in a way that would.
Now, before we get to what he doesn't accept, I do this contradistinction part. It should be the key. Now, but if the contradistinction was in contradistinction to the Socinian view that God can just gratuitously forgive people and there's no need for there to be any kind of satisfaction of justice, that I agree that those two are competitive to the extent that someone says God can just forgive sin without any satisfaction of justice. But of course, that's not my position or your position, Dan. It's just it's a position. It is an historic position, but now we have to hear what I mean. Unless you have other thoughts, let's hear what the contradistinction to is. If he says it, I don't remember if he says it here.
Yeah, just to
go ahead.
Sorry, just to re-summarize my thoughts on that. So the contradistinction. There might be an extreme form of PSA, which is the identical penalty view of PSA. That is in contradistinction to the governmental theory. On the other hand, on the governmental theory side, there could be a principle. There's a form of governmental theory that is based on the idea that an innocent person can't pay for somebody else's crimes. That is in contradistinction. It's mutually exclusive with PSA, with any form of PSA. But you don't have to go to those two extremes. So Grotius's view of governmental theory of atonement is completely compatible with the equivalent or substitutionary penalty rather than the identical penalty view of PSA. So yeah, I think this just requires a lot more nuance, than being treated here.
And leading to things like antinomianism, where because God died for for my sins, I can then live however I want. The atonement is a provisionary sacrifice of Christ, conditional upon faith in Jesus Christ. He died.
So I like that he's saying conditional on faith on Jesus Christ as opposed to faith and works. I'm happy to accurately represent that that's his view. But anyway, we some of this is rehashing stuff that he's already said earlier in the video.
Right, but I'll just keep hammering. So for John Miley, this was one of his major problems. He's saying if the identical penalty was paid, then salvation isn't and can't be conditional.
What does he mean identical? Identical meaning John Smith has committed a sin, John Smith has been put to death. That would be identical. So there's no, how is that substitution if it's identical?
So right, it's not. So okay, take the $100, right? So if you got $100 debt and your $100 bill is paid, then it can't be forgiven. But it's not even conditional on the part of whoever lent the $100 in the first place. They've been paid. There's no condition on which that bill will be forgiven to you. There's no condition on which it will be paid in the future. It has been paid. So in other words, John Miley is saying that if Christ pays the identical penalty, then there is no such thing as justification by faith.
I'm not sure how identicality is. I don't understand how identicality plays into that, but maybe that's not just for me not to understand it tonight.
If the one penalty is wiped out, then there's no conditions on the person left. After the one penalty is paid, there's no condition on forgiveness. There's no condition on payment because it's already been paid.
But I guess my comment isn't so much about whether conditionality is there or not. My question is about what does identicality versus equivalent have to do with that?
Because if it's equivalent, then the judge could hold application in either accept it or not.
But why couldn't he do that in the identical case?
Because it's identical. Like, it's what's owed. The judge can't withhold it.
He can't withhold it. The judge can't withhold it.
So okay. So let's say John commits something worthy of death. John dies. The judge can't sit there and say, "Well, John still hasn't satisfied justice yet." No, he's died. That was all that was due him, and it's done.
Right.
So if the identical penalty is paid, then there's no condition left.
If the identical is paid by the person who owes it, then there's no condition left.
Right. But if it's done by a substitute, it's no longer identical.
But then if that's the out, then I mean, who holds to penal substitution with no substitution?
Exactly. That's a great point. That's what I said from the get-go. It's like, what he's saying is the PSA view, like basically a commercial transaction or an identical penalty. It's rare. People use that every once in a while. You see someone use that language, but it's very rare someone will actually say it that way.
I'm not sure how. Well, I'm afraid to derail it.
No, but I think you're actually on the right track. I think we got each other now.
All right. He's almost wrapped up his thoughts, I believe. We have about a minute left of his audio. I don't know if there'll be any more good breaking points, but I'll try to give him a chance to wrap things up here.
In my place as a substitute, so I could be forgiven, and it's by faith and only by faith. So in other words, yes, Jesus died for me, but if I don't repent of my sins, if I don't believe, God says I'm not saved, even though he died for me. And so the penal substitutionary view would view this as just de facto, because Christ died for you, you're automatically forgiven. Well, wait a minute.
Okay, I'll pause him again. I don't know of anyone who says you are automatically forgiven. I know of people who say that you're guaranteed to be forgiven, or something like that, but automatically forgiven. That doesn't represent the free grace position for sure. That free grace puts a condition of faith. You have to believe, and if you don't believe, so if he's targeting the free grace folks, this one misses. If he's targeting the Calvinist folks, Calvinists don't say automatic. That's kind of like a caricature of a Calvinist position. So I'm not sure where he's going with this. I don't know if you know of somebody who would say it's automatic.
Maybe the eternal justification guys, yeah. But I think that would fall under hyper-Calvinism rather than plain Calvinism.
Hold on. God says you have to repent, you have to believe. So what did the atonement accomplish? What did it do? Well, what it did, according to Romans 3, it had demonstrated God's righteousness so he could be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus Christ. I just want to say real quick, I just recently I picked up John Miley, 2-volume set.
So yeah, you mentioned Miley a few times, for people are interested, I think it was in the late 1800s that Miley wrote.
Yeah, he was one of the later of the Methodist theologians. Now, you can find similar expressions in Richard Watson, which is early days in Methodist theology, because he was a governmental theory guy too. But I think Miley's expression of it is the most famous and most pronounced version of it.
Systematic theology. It's out of print, and I hope that one day we can get these reprinted. It's 1989 volume set. Found it online. It's in great condition, by the way. But he is a great teacher of the governmental theory of the atonement. Another one is H. Orton Riley.
I don't know if you're familiar with Riley. I'm not. Not
the 19
AC Riley, but not H. Orton.
1940s or something like that. Yeah. I've read his systematic theology. Yeah. He's pretty good at he harvests lots of different earlier Methodist systematic theologies. He's a systematizer of systematic theologies. And
I know Kenneth Gritter, who I
don't. You know Kenneth Gritter. I'm not so familiar.
Yeah. These are my peeps.
Your peeps.
Not read, but he's also a defender of this as well. So those are just some texts that you can read if you want to understand this theory more. Any questions, drop them in the comment. Hit the like button. Thanks for tuning in. Subscribe if you haven't.
So clearly that's the like and subscribe portion, which I think is great. If you're interested, that's the place to go. Method Ministries, I think, is what his YouTube channel is called. If you're interested to go there, this isn't designed as my personal endorsement of him or anything like that. Just for those who are interested. Obviously, he and I disagree. That's why we're going to debate. But I can debate people and still endorse large swaths of what they have to say. Otherwise, I'd never be able to have somebody who's a debate partner and a debate opponent. Which reminds me, Dan and I debating, for those who are just tuning in, Dan and I will be debating free grace as our next debate in like 3 or 4 days from now. I don't know the exact. It is July 12th, right? 8 p.m.?
Yeah, 12th. Yeah, Saturday. Yeah. It's come 3 days.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Let's get rocking and rolling, baby. It's time.
Yes, you say 3 days. 9th, 10th, 11th would be. Is it the 11th or is it the 12th? I know it's.
No, it's the 12th. Yeah, you're right. So, okay. Yeah, I guess YouTube is rounding. So
yeah.
if you round, you round to 3. But yeah, it's 3 days in a piece. Yeah.
I see, because it's already past 8 p.m. Eastern, so in less than 4 days, less than 24-hour days.
No, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I don't know why YouTube is saying 3 days. We actually have 4 days. I'm gonna count it. Let's say 4 days.
We'll round it up to the nearest day. All right. So the within 4 days we'll be discussing that, but we don't have any planned prep episodes between now and then. I would like to discuss some canon related topics at some point, but it will be as time permits. I have listened to parts of some people's responses. I believe Steve Christie's interested to come on here and discuss aspects of that debate, which I think would be a fun conversation. But given the fact that we have a big debate on Saturday, and then I have 2 additional debates in the next part of the month, it's going to be a busy month. But I'm definitely looking forward to my interactions with Lucas. I know you and Lucas have done some episodes, at least at SEA, right?
Yeah. So I've been on his channel. We did a series on Arminianism there, and then he's been on the SEA channel. He actually debated baptismal regeneration, actually, on the SEA channel recently. Yeah, that was a good discussion with another member of SEA, but from the Baptist side. So it was like basically the Methodist or Lutheran view of baptism versus the Baptist view of baptism on SEA. It was a great discussion. Yeah, please check it out.
Yeah, thanks. And let's see, I saw you covered some of the comments as we were going through, but I wanted to say thank you, Frenny Cosmic, Michelle Cherie, KJV, Algo OPC, And Richard Firks, discerner. And he said this prayer is more important than reading 1,000-page intellectual books of someone's opinion that's most likely influenced in a bad way. Anyway, I prayer is very important. So I don't think you have to choose between praying and reading books, but to the extent that someone does find themselves in that position, praying to God is really important. Brother Martin, I don't remember seeing you here before, but welcome.
I've known him for 100 years. How you doing, Brother Martin?
Maybe it's because we're also broadcasting on SEA. So, and Tony Parkinson, good to see you here as well. Maybe also coming via, and good to see you, DR. And I think that's everyone whose comments I saw. Did I miss anybody? If I did, it's unintentional.
But, no, this has been great. Thank you. Good topic. And God be with you on all your upcoming debates. And God be with everyone in the audience as well.
And also with